So welcome everybody to another episode of Chocolate Travels. Today I'm talking to Alejandro from Revival Cacao Mexico. Welcome, Alejandro. How long have you been interested in cacao? And when and why did you decide to start this company?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an interesting question because I'm not Mexican, I'm from Spain. So I moved to Mexico 6 years ago. And the interesting thing is that before that, I didn't know anything at all about cacao.
Okay.
So I have a background in fresh produce. I'm an economist.
Mm.
So I was working in Europe specifically in Spain for German companies exporting fresh produce. So I mean, my background is in agriculture, but I didn't know anything about cacao.
Okay.
So a little over 6 years ago, actually 7 years ago, by then I had already met my Colombian girlfriend that lives in Mexico City. But at the same time, the trip where I met my Colombian girlfriend, I was also here in Mexico, traveling all over southern Mexico with a Mexican guy that I met in Europe that convinced me that maybe making chocolate in Mexico was a good idea.
Okay.
Coincidentally, a friend of mine in Valencia, where I'm from, had a little bit of experience, a cacao background. So back then I was 27. I was bored. So this 9-to-5 job when you're a 27-year-old is not very exciting. I wanted a little bit more of an adventure.
Right.
So the pieces of the puzzle were on the table. So I had met a Mexican guy that wanted to do something with chocolate. I had a Spanish friend that had a background in cacao, that he worked for several months in Honduras working with cacao. So I said, okay, I will travel to Mexico on my vacation and see what's cacao, because I didn't know, and if it's possible to start a company.
Okay.
Right? So during that trip, I met my Colombian girlfriend. So after the trip, I said, okay, let's move to Mexico, right? So I quit my job out of the blue just one Friday.
Wow.
And I flew to Mexico on Monday.
Wow.
So not looking back, it was a leap of faith assumption. Either if I have to fail, it's better to fail now, right? When you are 28 and you don't have any family burdens. So
yeah, that's a good point.
I moved to Mexico. Yeah. The idea was to start a drinking chocolate brand.
Okay.
Right? So it didn't work out from the very beginning. I mean, we didn't even sign anything. As everybody knows that runs a business, you marry your partners, your business partners, when you start seeing strange things or odd things before even starting. It's better not to do anything at all. It's better to regret beforehand, so to speak, rather than having trouble down the road.
Right.
So I was in Mexico. The plan totally collapsed. So I was on my own. So I decided to start the business myself. Right.
Okay.
So I started a brand called Revival Drinking Chocolate that was focused on delivering high quality chocolate to per-wave coffee shops.
Okay. So you would process the cacao, you would make the chocolate and then sell it.
Right. I mean, I didn't know anything about cacao, but I knew some farmers already by then. We are talking, this is 2017.
Okay.
2017, right? So I remember it very well because the month I wanted to start, there was a huge, massive earthquake that struck Mexico City. It was in September of 2017. It was a disaster. Hundreds of people died. I mean, it was like very hard. So I had to postpone launching the brand, right? But I mean, the assumption is still holds. I mean, the hypothesis, the fact that fair-wave coffee shops use terrible chocolate. So you mix the best coffee you can ever have with terrible chocolate to make a mocha, you know.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even in Canada, you know, even in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, it's a lot of coffee shops. Chocolate is just, you know, syrups and cocoa powder, sugar, and it's awful. It's awful, and it doesn't have to be. So what is it that now that you've sort of, you know, after all that sort of chaos and which is exciting too, you seem like you have a side and adventure as well. But what with your company now, what are you trying to achieve in regards to cacao? And obviously more specifically Mexican cacao. What are your goals?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, well, basically, I didn't really like push it. The brand, it was very labor intensive, very time consuming. You know, I mean, coffee shops were indeed buying from me chocolate, but at one point I had a trade-off. Either I go forward buying bigger machinery, or I help the farmers, because the farmers that I was working with, were struggling. And we will understand later on why fine cacao in Mexico is non-existent, why is one of the most unknown origins in the world, although it's probably the oldest continuously grown origin. It was the first international origin ever. Right. So the history here surrounding cacao and chocolate is amazing. It's very interesting, but the current state is it's hard for it to get any worse. So I was buying small amounts from farmers that were properly fermenting, that were caring about quality, but I mean there was no market. So I saw them struggling, and I had a background in international trade and first produce, and I said, okay, let's do both things, right? But eventually I stopped. Like at that trade-off, I decided to focus on the beans rather than on the chocolate, because I mean it was very time-consuming. You know, you need to deliver all the chocolate around the city. It's also, I mean, again, people are used to cheap chocolate.
Right, they're not going to pay a lot for.
They are not, right, and also coffee shops are used to huge margins when it comes to coffee. Right, you know, it's not the same serving a coffee cup than serving a chocolate cup. Chocolate is a food. Chocolate is calories, right? Coffee has 0 calories. So it might be something that is not important, but it is important. So you want to charge the same, but you cannot expect to have the same cost, right? So I switched to working slowly with cacao. It wasn't easy at all because, again, there is no fermentation tradition in Mexico. Right? 99.9% of cacao is unfermented, what is called lavado, for drinking chocolate. Mexico barely produces 1/3 of all the cacao that is being consumed.
So for those people who don't know, what is cacao lavado, and why do Mexicans do that, and what do they use it for?
Yeah. Well, we're jumping right to which question was that?
We'll go back and forth. It's okay.
We're going back and forth, but I mean, it's important to understand why Mexico doesn't even show up in any fine cacao map, you know? So first, because, well, Mexico is a net importer of cacao. So
is it what, sorry?
A net importer. It imports cacao. Why? Because and it's the other way around with coffee. Mexico is a huge producer of coffee, but as of today, just 2 states, Tabasco and Chiapas, produce 99% of the cacao that the country produces, right? So, but this doesn't even cover 30% of the demand. So Mexico is a chocolate exporter, but it's just multinationals exporting commodity chocolate. So Mexico imports from Colombia, Ecuador, Indonesia, West Africa to process the cacao. The cacao that is being produced inside the country goes mostly or is devoted to the domestic consumption, which is basically drinking chocolate. For millennia, cacao in Mexico, or probably in many other places too, I mean, has been consumed unfermented, which means washed. Lavado. Lavado means washed. What does washed mean? as farmers, they just take the wet beans, they just remove the mucilage with water, and they just dry the cacao. It's raw cacao technically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, fermentation is a Western concept. 1,000 years ago, fermentation here, I mean, it was non-existent as a concept, right? So, sorry, I will close this. So, and that's what people still consume in Mexico. They just use wash lavado, which is raw. It's very astringent. It's very bitter, but that's not something negative if you wanted to use it as a drink, because you put sugar, you put spices.
Right.
So it's a very like ingrained, rooted tradition in Mexico. And also, I mean, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, all cacao was consumed as a drink everywhere. So the world changed, but Mexico in a way. So people are still doing business as usual, which means using unfermented raw cacao to make drinks.
Yeah, you're essentially you're using the same product, cacao, but they're creating totally different products. You know, chocolate for people in United States or Canada is very different than what chocolate means to people in Mexico. And even like when you're talking about the history, you know, some people believe that cacao for a long time had, you know, only the best cacao in the world. And they did have some good varieties as well. But you have to keep in mind too, like you said, traditionally, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Mocaya people before them, they were mixing that cacao that was washed with corn and chili and pepper and annatto and all these things. So it didn't have to be super, super fine and delicate. Why, you know, it made sense to have it very harsh. So, you know, that culture, like you said, it's still there in Mexico, right?
Yeah.
And that probably has a big part of why maybe Mexican cacao is not well known as it is today because of that.
Right. Actually, indeed, there are dozens of drinks made with cacao, but not only with cacao. Right. You know, I mean, there is food culture in Mexico. It's also about beverages as meals. You know, the farmer went to the field and he brought with him, like, for example, I don't know, tascalate, tejate, so all sorts of drinks made with corn, you know, atoles. It was cacao, but also corn, but also chiles, but also other spices, you know. So it's and people still drink hot chocolate, but it's not probably the most popular way of
yeah, it's
consuming
interesting because I had a friend from Chiapas who made me a drink like that. It had cornmeal and cacao powder and sugar and cinnamon or something, and he would blend it up in the blender and pour it like that with all the sediment still there. And you don't see that anywhere outside of Mexico. Nobody does that anywhere anymore.
Nobody, yeah. And you can use roasted corn, you can use nixtamal corn. I mean, there's a huge galaxy of drinks made with cacao, but not only just cacao, right? The fascinating thing about Mexican cacao is not only the rich history, the mocayas, actually, we will talk about it later, but I'm the implementing partner of the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund here in Mexico. We are mapping all what's left of Criollo genetics in Mexico. And we were in Soconusco, at the Paso de la Mada archaeological site, where the first, where American archaeologists found the first cacao traces in Mexico, dating back to almost 2,000 years before Christ. So now, they found like vessels and where they found the Theobroma traces that belong to the Mocayas, one of the first, if not the first, sedentary civilization in Mesoamerica. Right. You know, so they have found Theobroma traces in Ecuador that are older, right? But suddenly, out of the blue, 4,000 years ago, you find Theobroma traces in Soconusco. Nobody knows how these Theobroma traces show up there, right? Yeah. So starting from the Mocayas to the Maya, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, the Izapans, you know, so many cultures have cacao as a big important pillar of the culture, right? So when the Spaniards, when the Europeans come to Mexico, they not only make Mexican cacao the first international origin, because the first cacao to ever reach Asia was Mexican cacao through the Philippines. The first cacao that was shipped to Europe was Mexican cacao. The first time that chocolate was made outside of the Americas was in Spain, right? So, but also, they also exported the technology to process cacao. Because now the metates seem like something like very, very typical from Oaxaca, right?
Okay.
People go to Oaxaca, you see the women using the metates, but that was the only way that people knew how to process cacao for centuries. You see old paintings, I don't know, in England or Italy or the US in the 16th, 17th centuries, and they were using metate.
Still using metate, yeah.
So, and it was, I mean, that's the big role or important role that Mexico played. It was not only the first international origin, it was also the only way that people knew how to consume chocolate, which was as a drink using metates, right? So, coming back to the fermentation and lavado, the tradition is still alive in Mexico. The problem is that here, or people tend to romanticize traditions. If you don't evolve a tradition, you can get stuck, right? And the problem here is that most drinks that you find in Mexico are made with very bad cacao, with over-roasted cacao, with a lot of sugar. So romanticization of tradition can lead you to a dead end, because even if it's lavado, it's processed the wrong way. You over-roast it, you use, as little cacao as possible.
Well, another point is that even, thousands of years ago, they were likely using more of other varieties of cacao, which maybe tasted better, right? There's some cacao I had from Peru, which was barely fermented, barely roasted. And if that was a bulk cacao, it would have tasted terrible. But actually, it wasn't too bad. It had really nice flavors. It was very light. So, they're using the same tradition, but they don't realize perhaps they were not using the same cacao as their ancestors were, right?
That's a very interesting point, because everywhere in Latin America, when you mention Criollo, almost always it means white cacao, right?
Right.
So, or lighter color cacao,
blonde,
which is very interesting, because it seems, light cacao, white cacao doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary perspective. Why? Because, the monkeys or other animals that were like sucking the beans, the mucilage is sweet. But why is the seed bitter? So that they don't chew the seed, right? For the plant, it makes sense. This is very common with other fruits, right? So it's appealing. You tease animals so that they eat the fruit, but they don't chew the seeds. They spread the seeds.
Yeah.
So, with Maya paintings, or you see monkeys all over again associated with cacao. They were like the protectors, the guardians of cacao, the monkeys for the Mayas. So, technically speaking, or probably, white cacao was a mutation, because it doesn't make any sense that cacao is white, because then animals would eat the seed.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
But then, also cacao was spread by nomads. We don't know how very well, because you cannot store cacao seeds.
Right.
Nobody knows how cacao show up out of the blue in Soconusco, because when you harvest a pod, you have a week to plant the tree. So what are you doing? Planting a tree every week?
It's hard to imagine carrying little trees around, it doesn't really make sense, but
it doesn't really make sense, but maybe it was the case. We don't know. But again, they were nomads. We don't even know if they knew about agriculture or whatever. So my bet is that Criollo cacao is a mutation that was favored by humans, because it was less bitter.
Well, they used to, in Mexico, they had those, what do they call those, under the ground, they have those sinkholes. They would grow the trees in there. They would have a whole thing. So it could have been a mutation, or it could have been humans crossbred. But like you said, it's probably not something that was spontaneous in nature, because it probably wouldn't have lasted very long. The monkeys would have eaten the seeds. But if humans in Mexico were preserving them in these sinkholes and propagating them, that's most likely why they were around. And maybe that's the cacao they were using for a long time.
Yeah,
their chocolate.
and that's what you said. The cacao that was used 2,000 years ago is not the same that we're using now. You know,
Right.
I mean, actually, it's very rare to find like you find isolated pockets of pure genetics in Latin America, but I mean, it's a mix of everything. It's like a huge melting pot. Also, Mexico. So we cannot judge the drinks or the uses with what the current genetics, because it was totally different. Also, with pataste, for example, pataste bicolor is also being used. We will talk later. It's also being used in Oaxaca, and it's white. It's 0 bitter, 0% bitter, as well as Criollo, 0. So, but such trees don't last long in nature because animals will eat the seeds.
Interesting. Okay, so that brings us to a couple questions here. So, what origins of Mexican cacao do you offer? Why did you choose these, and what do you look for when you are selecting your cacao today?
Yeah, I mean, well, as I've said, basically cacao is being grown in Chiapas and Tabasco. That accounts for 99% of national production, the domestic production. So technically speaking, you don't have many places to choose from. With coffee, you have 16 states that produce coffee. With cacao, you have 2, and then marginally you have Oaxaca and you have Guerrero. Oaxaca doesn't produce cacao, which is interesting. People associate Oaxaca with chocolate, but they don't even, some people don't even know that they grow cacao. I mean, it's very strange, you know, but that was not always the case. It has been lost, because before you had cacao in Veracruz, you have cacao in Yucatan, but now it's just Tabasco and Chiapas. And Tabasco is 2/3 and Chiapas is 1/3, mainly Soconusco, but both are very different, very, very different.
But you mentioned that a lot of the cacao, some of the cacao in Mexico is not very good. So how do you find the good cacao in Tabasco and Chiapas?
Right. I mean, starting with Chiapas, for example, if you go to Soconusco, there the genetics are very different with compared to what you find in Tabasco. In Soconusco, most of the heirloom genetics have been preserved. It's a genetic mess, but this is also a good thing, because there were no large-scale government programs or whatever trying to replace what you already had, which is something that is an issue in most of Latin America. With introduction of like miracle varieties that everybody has to grow, in Soconusco, this didn't happen. So it's a very small area with a lot of genetic diversity, a lot. Every town, I mean, you have cacao at sea level and cacao above 1,000 meters above sea level, right? I mean, you have all different, and every town, although they are close to each other, have different genetics. You cut the cacao and it's mostly white or pink or things like that. So, which means, of course, again, it's not just purely heirloom. Actually, one of the tasks of the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund is to understand what does heirloom mean.
I was just going to ask you, yeah, because there's different, in agriculture, people define heirlooms differently, right? People assume, if you're a consumer and you hear heirloom, you think, oh, that must be really, really good, but not necessarily, right? You know, it's essentially a specific genetic cultivar that is being passed down traditionally in a certain area. People seem to like it. And I think it has to be self-pollinating, not self-pollinating, but what's the word? It has to be able to be pollinated on its own, you know, without human interference, I think.
Right? You're right.
Yeah.
But actually, the main variable here is the fact that, I mean, in agriculture, in coffee or whatever, everything is based on grafting trees. You graft a variety, so you control. I mean, you know what you have. You know, you have a Royal Gala or a Fuji with apples, right? Or in coffee, you have Caturra, or you have Colombia, or you have Bourbon, you have, I mean, you know what you have. With cacao is, farmers don't graft trees. They just take a pod of the tree they like, and they just plant the seeds. So you will literally have the offsprings will be totally different.
Right.
Because you just grab a pod and you have a white bean, a purple bean, a pink bean, right?
Yeah.
So
It's
and
not,
they plant it.
they're not clones. It's more like brothers and sisters, different.
Exactly, and that's what you find in Soconusco. I mean, you have an explosion of genetics. Some like weak. In the past, someone tried to bring a sort of program, right, to bet on a specific variety. But I mean, in general, you have what you have, which is a mixture with a huge component of Theobroma cacao. You know, but I mean, it doesn't make any sense to bet on variety or to talk about varieties because it's too much. It's overwhelming what you find there.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing too. Is even if you talk about a broad variety, there's different populations of the same variety are going to have different attributes. And like you said, there's not a lot of pure varietals out there. Cacao is a lot more complex, so it makes more sense to talk about the cacao at this farm or this region and how it tastes, as opposed to saying I have this variety, right? Like everyone has Criollo, but it doesn't all taste the same. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good, some of it's more of a mixed bag than others, right? So that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it depends on the regions in the world. Of course, I mean, it's not the same. I mean, if you talk about cacao in Thailand or cacao in Timor, Eastern Timor, whatever, I mean, countries that didn't have cacao 60 years ago, right? So it's not the same talking about such origins. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just stating a fact.
Yeah.
Cacao in Madagascar was non-existent 150 years ago, whereas cacao in Latin America, in most countries, is native to the place.
Right.
In some countries, such as, for example, the Inca Empire didn't consume chocolate, right? Or we don't know if they consume chocolate. Apparently, they did.
That's a good point. A lot of people talk about the Incas and chocolate, but we don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that, right?
Right. Or Colombia. Most of civilizations in Colombia were not too developed because in order to consume chocolate, you need sedentary a sedentary civilization, and you need a minimum of technological development to process the cacao, right? So, I mean, you have cacao in Latin America, but you didn't have civilizations that care about cacao in all the countries.
Right. That's a good point. They could have been eating the fruit, and that's it. Maybe.
We don't know. Actually, we don't even know if the first cacao traces in Ecuador or Soconusco were due to chocolate, or they were fermenting the pod to brew a sort of alcoholic drink.
Right.
It seems the latter. Why? Because you do find the Theobroma traces that date back 4,000, 5,000 years ago, but you don't find the tools, the stone tools to process.
Yeah, because in Santa Ana La Florida, they have vessels which hold liquid, so people assume it's chocolate, but that's a good point too, right? The fermenting of the fruit. Yeah. Yeah,
because for example, in Mexico, the Mucayas, you don't find any stone tools to process cacao. The Olmecs, 1,000 years later, do have these tools, right? But not the Mucayas. So most probably, they were just fermenting the pulp.
Well, you really do your research, eh?
Yeah, of course. I mean,
that's awesome.
I mean, it's not just about business. If it's just about money, I wouldn't do it, right?
Yeah.
So
no, that's good.
You need to, I want to believe that I'm involved in something bigger than just a business.
So you mentioned about how you're involved with the heirlooms and whatnot. So how would you explain to the general public about the varieties in cacao varieties that exist in Mexico today? What would you, how would you describe them?
Exactly. So coming back to Soconusco, this is the situation in Soconusco, right? It's a genetic mess, which is a boon and a handicap or a challenge, depending on how you see it, because when it comes to fermentation, it's very difficult. Fermenting cacao in Soconusco is incredibly difficult. Why? Because you don't have homogeneity when it comes to genetics. So what people haven't understood is that in some countries, you just build a fermentation center, you just collect whatever you find, you ferment it, and it will be more or less okay. In Soconusco, you are doomed to fail. And I've seen many companies failing.
So for people who don't know, why is it more complicated to ferment cacao with a mixture of genetics than it is something more consistent? Why?
Of course, yeah, because first, how do you know the genetics? You see how the raw seeds look like, right? So, for example, if you have a single variety, a monoculture of, let's say, CCM 51, that has been grafted, I mean, it's not genetics are not a variable, are a constant. So you know that the fermentation boxes will contain the same variety, right? So you can develop recipes that are one size fits all. If you go to places such as Soconusco, where you have, I mean, you just do random cut tests of raw or fresh wet beans, you find a white color, totally purple, pink, yellow, whatever. So when you put everything inside a box, each variety will need a different fermentation days.
Right.
Right. So the more bitter the cacao is, as a rule of thumb, the longer it takes to ferment, and the other way around. Criollos, technically, Criollo, I mean, there is no clear-cut distinction between varieties, but you can talk about tendencies.
Right.
If you see the pod, it's like it looks like a lizard or like a dinosaur egg. There are high chances that it's more Criollo than something that is like melon-shaped, like smooth skin, So there are some
consistencies there. Yeah.
Right. So it's a tendency. That's why, for example, in Soconusco, they say that they have Trinitario Criollado. I mean, this definition is very restrictive, but it tells you that it's not pure Criollo, but with some Trinitario, you rarely find small pods with smooth skin, right? Which are more forasteros, right? So it's tricky to ferment because you need to know what you have, right? And you need to develop recipes.
Because what happens if you have a mixture of forastero and Criollo, and the forastero needs 7 days, so you ferment 7 days, that the other cacao might be over fermented, right, and have some off flavors. And then if you ferment it for the other one, you don't ferment it enough for the forastero, and it tastes too bitter, too astringent, right? So and then you blend it together, and you don't know what you're going to get.
Exactly. That's why you need to, I mean, you need to fine tune fermentation. You need to know what the farmers have, and you need to understand how to pair different farmers inside specific boxes, fermentation boxes.
So it requires. Are they willing to separate? And
they can't separate it, but what the farmers have, So you more or less, I mean, after harvest, you develop a sense of that. That's why you cannot just work with someone different every time. You need like a specific area to focus on that specific area around you. And if you are in Tapachula or you are in Chamulapita, you cannot suddenly buy from Cacahuatan cacao or from Tuzantan, because it will wreak havoc in the fermentation. That's why you need, it's a very localized, a very focused post-harvest process. And this is something that people don't understand. I mean, big companies or whatever, that's why they fail constantly in Soconusco. Everything has to be relatively small scale, and you need to understand and work with the same farmers and know what these farmers have. And you don't mix farmer A with farmer C because you know that the cacaos are totally different, because farmer C suddenly started planting like hybrids,
Although, so what is the solution in that area in regards to fermentation? Whose gets fermented where?
Well, in my case,
their own farm.
Yeah, in my case, I do work with co-ops. I mean, it's co-op-based. Good quality cacao has to be co-op-based, or single estate, which also ferments from neighboring farmers or whatever. So huge fermentation facilities are doomed to fail in Soconusco because you cannot overcome all the genetic diversity, right? It might sound strange because some countries produce thousands and thousands of tons, but also that's why in Soconusco, everybody basically washes cacao. Why? Because it's more Criollo, it's less bitter than Tabasco, and Oaxaca, when you go to Oaxaca to eat moles or drink chocolate, it's Soconusco cacao, right? So fermentation projects are very uncommon in Soconusco, but those that thrive have to follow this golden rule. You need to understand. You need to work with the same farmers year after year, or you need to you cannot just collect wet beans randomly all over the place because you will fail. Your consistency will go to hell, and you will have very terrible batches. Oh, and the other thing is that to work on a batch basis. I mean, everything a batch basis means you cannot just mix everything in one big blend, right? Because sometimes some batches will not be fit for purpose, so you will need to won't be fit for bean to bar, for example.
Right.
You will need to sell them as lavado, right? So it requires a lot of on the ground local knowledge and a lot of fine tuning. Otherwise, Soconusco Cacao doesn't work. So nobody cares why, because it's too much of a struggle. So you can find cheaper and easier origins all over the place. So in the case of Soconusco, I don't ferment myself. I work hand in hand with co-ops. I have an engineer that assists in quality control and fermentation and post-harvest, because you cannot have a one-size-fits-all recipe. It depends on what you have. It depends on each batch. It depends on whatever. So what you do is, in order to prevent over-fermentation, you ferment less than you should, and then you do some tricks with drying, because if you dry, whether you believe it or not, when you dry properly, fermentation keeps on going.
Right.
Very subtle, but you can fine-tune what you couldn't achieve during fermentation during the drying process. So that's another. Actually, I would say that drying is probably the single most important recipe in Soconusco, at least. You need to fine-tune that also in order to avoid over-fermentation and under-fermentation. Although most probably for some origins, it's slightly under-fermented because you cannot do it otherwise. But the genetic Criollo component helps you with that.
Right.
Because if it's more Criollo and it's slightly under-fermented compared to other origins, I mean, you will never reach 80% fermentation here, or 85%. Why? Because it means that some beans are 120%, right? So, but genetics help you with that, right? So it's tricky, but it's challenging, but nobody does it. So that's an interesting thing too, right?
That's interesting. So your goal in that case is to ferment the more bitter cacao properly and risk under fermenting the Criollo, because chances are the Criollo will still taste a bit better under fermented than if the other one was over fermented.
Right. Yeah. It's more or less that way. But I mean, it's on a case by case basis. You cannot say I ferment 5 days, 6 days, whatever. I mean, if you do it properly, you can even ferment Criollo 7 days. It doesn't matter. I mean, it depends on temperature. It depends on what you're doing, on the turnings.
So these farmers that you're fermenting with, are they used to fermenting, or did you have to ask them to ferment because they used to wash it?
Everybody used to wash it originally, but the logic behind these small co-ops, I worked with 2 co-ops for over 5 years, and it's that they wanted to break that vicious circle, right?
They wanted to.
Yeah. That's why they formed a co-op. Because I mean, one thing that it's interesting that you need to understand to grasp what's going on in Mexico is that Mexican cacao, even the worst lavado that you can find, has always a higher price than the market price, than the world market price. Here, nobody understands, nobody cares, nobody pays attention to the world market price, the C price. Nobody cares.
Because they're using it themselves, right?
No, I mean, because it doesn't affect farmers. I mean, what does it mean? The Mexican industry or the Mexican companies tend to clear out the market in Mexico and then they import mostly, right? Or some companies don't want to use other cacao rather than Mexican cacao. So that puts a lot of pressure on prices, right? So a terrible lavado might cost over $3 a kilo, right? In cash, in hand. So that's unheard of. I would say 99% of all the other countries in the world, where everybody's paid according to the spot price of cacao at that specific moment. In Mexico, nobody knows about that price. Only big importers that import, like Nestle or whatever, that import from other countries, right? So there is an artificial high demand for lavado cacao. So there is not really an incentive to try to break this loop.
Right.
So because lavado will sell no matter what. Maybe the price is not the one that you want, but it always finds a market.
So if these co-ops are focusing more on the fermentation and focusing on the bean to bar craft chocolate buyers, will they get more than lavado?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
So that is the incentive there.
Yes, that's the incentive. But I mean, the thing is that it's a less liquid market, which means it's harder to sell. It takes more time, and sometimes farmers don't want to.
It takes more time, and it's harder to sell. Why? Because you don't have enough buyers yet for it, or what?
Right. I mean, basically because there is no domestic market for fine cacao in Mexico. It's like marginal, but very marginal. And the handicap is that it's relatively more expensive than other origins, Mexican cacao. I mean, no wonder why. Well, first, it's a matter of quality. Then it's a matter of scale. And then it's a matter of price. And that explains you why no main wholesaler of fine cacao works with Mexican cacao. Because you have cheap, good cacao everywhere else. Although Mexico is close to the US or close to, I mean, the cacao is not grown in isolated places, you know? So infrastructure in Mexico is surprisingly good. So, but still, you don't find it. So nobody cares about me. Big wholesalers in Europe or the US don't work with Mexican cacao for many reasons. One of the reasons is that it's like a vicious circle, you know, because you don't ferment because it's harder, and still, if lavado will be sold anyway. But if you don't learn how to ferment, you won't get better prices, right? And so on and so forth.
Right.
And also co-ops get a higher farm market price. So can be $5, $6, and above a kilo.
Do you see, because in other places, like I was talking to someone from Brazil recently, there's a lot of Brazilians now, young Brazilians are getting excited about bean to bar, and they're buying local Brazil cacao and making their own chocolate. Do you see any sort of thing like that happening in Mexico yet, or?
Yes, you do. Yeah. I mean, there has been like a sort of boom during the last 5 years. So 5 years ago, there were 0 bean to bar makers. Now there are, but still, it's hard. Why? Because first, people are used to cheap chocolate, as everybody else, as everywhere else, right?
But like in Mexico, just like in America, they have candy bars, right? Treats, sweets, that's chocolate for a lot of them.
Right. So then people tend to prefer drinking chocolate.
Right.
But it's terrible drinking chocolate. So that's why I criticize this romanticization of Mexican tradition so much, because you could use good cacao for drinks, but you don't. You go to Oaxaca and you see people over roasting cacao and not even winnowing it. Who cares? Because it's 70% sugar, right? Yeah. Is that traditional? Of course, it's not traditional.
Right.
500 years ago, you didn't even have sugar to begin with, so they had to use honey and things like that.
Yeah.
So
that's a good point too. I mean, they used to unsweeten their chocolate drinks, and they had a lot of spices, but maybe they were using a better quality cacao. It's funny because in like Canada, you go to Mexican grocery shops and they have Mexican drinking chocolate, the discs, and you buy it and people think, oh, that's amazing. But from my point of view, you taste it, they're like, this is very bad cacao, you know?
And it's not even most probably.
Sorry?
It's probably not even Mexican cacao. You find Abuelita,
right.
which is owned by Nestle, and it's not even Mexican cacao. It's like the Cacao Company is less than 20%.
Right.
So
right.
that's what you are showing the world, right? Oh, this is Mexican cacao, whatever.
They're selling an idea, but it's not authentic.
It's not authentic.
Yeah.
So that's why I say that it's so dangerous to get stuck in tradition, because you start eroding that tradition and you don't even notice because you don't get any feedback. And everybody romanticizes, no, my abuelita was making drinking chocolate for me, with a metate. It doesn't, this world doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. You go to the supermarket and you're buying rubbish cacao.
Yeah, that's not the same thing. Yeah.
Right.
Even with me, like I say, my grandparents were making food, certain foods, and I get the same recipe, but they were growing their own food in the backyard. They're growing their own tomatoes. They were using different ingredients. The flavor was very different. So I say, oh, I'm doing traditional, but you're not using the same ingredients. So it doesn't give it the same authenticity. It's not the same, right? And the same was with the chocolate. They're proud of their Mexican heritage and their traditions. That's good, but you have to remember that what you're creating today is not really what they were creating back then, right?
Right. That's why it's so interesting. And for the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund, we were filming all over southern Mexico. I mean, a sort of documentary. And it's interesting because we also visited people or restaurants in Oaxaca City that were trying to revive a tradition by adapting it to modern times, to make, for example, making a fashionable and tasty use of bicolor, right? So, or chocolate. So that these kind of projects are the ones that also sustain those farmers that are wanting to think outside the box. So what's the problem with Mexican cacao? I mean, production has been falling steadily for the last 40 years. Now we don't even know how much cacao is being produced. We think that it's 25,000 tons, but I don't see that. I mean, it's probably much less. It's ridiculous. I mean, Ecuador produces over 350,000 tons, right? In West Africa, you produce millions. In Dominican Republic, they produce like 80,000 tons, sorry, or 100,000 tons, more or less. Mexico it's still a lot more than Central America. I mean, you take Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and whatever, and they produce probably half of what Mexico is producing. So, but they have to focus on exporting it. They need to give an added value to the cacao, whereas in Mexico, you don't have that incentive.
So your job really nowadays is to, like you said, sort of preserve the cacao, the heirlooms that are there, the good ones that are there, establish better ways of fermenting, so that they have a cacao product that now these other bean-to-bar craft makers want to start using, right? And selling it basically to them. So are there a lot of makers outside of Mexico who want Mexican cacao now? Like these craft makers? Is there, or do you have to sell it,
It's hard. I mean, it's hard because, I mean, let's be honest, chocolate makers are used to buying from wholesalers.
Right.
I mean, they don't understand what the cacao. I mean, I get it, right?
Yeah.
It's a very hard business.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot just focus on everything. Exactly. But unlike, I mean, at least in Canada or the US, but in other places, in Australia or Europe, some makers do care and they do source directly, or they just whatever, I mean, they go to origin trips. But in the case of Canada and the US, it's all about the wholesalers,
right?
And we all know which wholesalers are. I'm not criticizing it. It's a very hard business. Making chocolate is very hard.
Yeah. So there's many different avenues you can take to make chocolate, right? You could be bean to bar, where you buy from a wholesaler. You can be direct trade. You go and you visit and you buy the beans yourself.
Right.
You could
which
be
is very, very risky.
You could be a mix.
Is very risky.
Yeah, exactly. So, some people, they're like, I can't do that. I can't go direct trade, but I still want to make chocolate. So there's a middle ground there, right? So
exactly. But in other countries, such as Australia or other countries where it's more difficult to source, they do team up to source together with specific origins. But what's the problem? Is that you contact chocolate makers, maybe they totally ignore you, But if you, or they try the cacao and I don't know, but if that cacao would be offered by the wholesaler, they might buy, right? Because they trust them. So what's the problem? That what I see is that eventually everybody uses the same origins. So you see the same Madagascar, you see the same Belize, you see the same Tanzania, you see the same whatever. Everybody uses the same. Mm-hmm. So it's also eventually I say that it will reach a critical point because everybody uses the same origins, and if you don't source or whatever, your storytelling will be handicapped in a way, right?
So that's a good point too, because there's practical reasons why some makers go to a distributor, right? There's not everyone, like I said, can go and visit and source directly. But then, like there's small distributors who are starting to grow. They maybe found this really good cacao and they're trying to sell it, and people don't want to buy it because they don't know who you are. Who are you? Which doesn't really make sense, because if you're a chef, if you're a chocolate maker, it shouldn't care how well known that person is. You should be able to try the cacao and make a decision. Do you like it or not, right? Is this really good cacao or is it not, right? That's what should matter. So that's an interesting dilemma.
Yeah, but again, I mean, you do find the people that are interested, but many people just buy from wholesalers. They don't. They make no exceptions. They don't. I mean, they fear that, which is, I mean, maybe this is like dangerous. How do you say? I am entering a swamp, but it's funny because, for example, I've talked to chocolate makers, and they say, no, this origin was terrible. This batch was very bad. They're not punishing the wholesaler because a couple of wholesalers are cornering the market. So there's no retaliation. What they are doing is they just buy another origin from the same wholesaler, right? Because they have so much market power,
right?
But you cannot retaliate. You cannot say, I will stop buying from you because you virtually have 30 origins. So in my case, if, for example, that was very hard at the beginning. When we were starting, we didn't know much. I didn't understand that you need to work on a batch basis in Soconusco. So maybe the sample is amazing and what I'm shipping is terrible because I didn't understand what was good and what was bad. I mean, it was a disaster because you're there for them. I shipped 1 bag or 2 bags, they were terrible, and they have never replied again, right? So, because, I mean, and that's not the case when you depend on a couple of wholesalers, right? And again, there are some people in the US that do care about sourcing, that they go directly. I mean, I'm not saying that. I mean, you find everything. Yeah, but even you find big chocolate makers that do still buy the same origins, but at a lower price. Because if you contact wholesalers and you say, I will place a 10-ton order, the price is different too. So again, I'm not criticizing anything. I'm just explaining what I see.
Yeah.
It's harder. I mean, one of my principles is not to work with wholesalers. I've been approached. I say I prefer not. I mean, it doesn't work because the topic about farm gate prices, whatever, it's all it's very popular, I would say. Chocolate makers don't understand what their farmers are getting paid.
Right.
Sometimes you see transparency reports and right, is the farmer only making this? There are 5 middlemen. Nobody cares about that. Nobody cares. Let's be honest, nobody cares because you don't go to the origin. You don't understand what you are working. So the price of it's exactly the same, like I would say supermarkets. What's the price of going to the supermarket whenever you want to buy whatever you want? That you need a huge amount of capital being tied in inventories, and you need a lot of middlemen that have to be flexible and have to adapt to your whims. It's the same with cacao. You want to go to the cacao supermarket, then this is the price, right? You want to establish direct connections with origin. You want to give them certainty that what they will harvest, it will be sold. Then it will be totally different. Higher farm gate prices, also higher risk, but it would be another industry.
That's a good point too, is that some of the makers are trying to promote this traceability. You know, I'm supporting these farmers, but like you said, there's a lot of middlemen between them and the farmer, where as if they were working more with someone like you, there's a lot more direct, there's a lot more accountability, and you know, the money perhaps will go to the farmers a little bit more than if you break it up into 5-6 different people before it gets there. I don't know if that makes sense what I said, but
yeah, I mean, for example, why don't wholesalers buy from Mexico? Farm gate price is too high. It's literally too high. They don't care, right? So what's the message you're sending? No, there is a too high farm gate price. You know,
right.
if it's above $3 a kilo of dry cacao, right? It's like we're not going to make money. So you see, I mean, I think I don't know who said that, but it was something like, if you work with a supplier year after year, and after 5 years or so, you are better off, but they aren't, something is wrong, right? So it's more or less the same with cacao. If you see that year after year, they are not making more money either with a higher farming price or whatever, higher yield or whatever, then what's the point? You know, you don't want to, or you don't care. But I mean, I get it. I mean, it's very.
But
it's
isn't
very
there?
tough.
It is, but isn't there also still a place for wholesalers, right? I mean, you kind of, is there or is there not? What do you?
No, yeah, no, of course. I mean, yeah, there's a place for wholesalers. I mean, you can have everything, right? If you're a small maker or whatever, it doesn't make sense to source anything directly. You know, wholesalers also make origins happen. What developing or undeveloped countries lack the most is capital. Capital is time, right? Farmers live from hand to mouth. You know, in developing countries, even in Mexico, you go to the bank, they don't care. The interest rate you pay is 30+%. Who can pay 35-40% interest rate yearly? It's impossible. You know, you make less than that. So there's no capital, there's no money. So you need a pool of capital, of cash, to keep the wheel turning.
Right.
So if nobody in origin does it, somebody from outside has to do it. So I mean, this is agriculture. I mean, this is nothing out of the ordinary. What happens with cacao? You find it in coffee and things like that. But what's the problem? That the debate is, where does the value chain stay, right? So if you source fine cacao and you buy a bar for $10, probably less than 5% of these $10 go to the origin, right? So I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm stating facts.
Yeah.
So it's also the problem of the origin, right? So if people don't wake up and they don't make chocolate or whatever, I've seen some interesting projects where chocolate makers source intermediate goods like cacao paste from origin, for example. So
well, do you think that's maybe a better way to go? Because you also sell some products, I think cocoa mass and some other things as well, that I assume are getting processed in Mexico.
Right.
Is that a better way perhaps to go in Mexico, to sell finished or half-finished products as opposed to just selling the cacao? Is that helpful?
Yes. And that's one of the main motivations behind my cacao pulp project. You know, making the most of the cacao pulp to both achieve higher farm gate prices and also create value, right? So the more you process at origin, technically the better, right? Because otherwise you will be stuck in a constant loop, even promoting domestic consumption, right? So if domestic consumption is high enough with enough interesting projects, chocolate makers abroad will have a problem, because domestic, I mean, if the demand at origin is zero, then foreign importers can do as they please, right? So the farmer would always prefer to buy locally or to sell locally, or it's faster. You get to know whom you are working with, and also a very interesting fact about how cacao works is, let's take, for example, wine, right? Wine, you grow the grapes and then you make the wine nearby. In the case of cacao, it's as if one country would grow the grapes and another country would make the wine. You have no feedback. It's totally splitted. So the farmer the farmer doesn't really understand what's going on with the cacao sometimes, because let's be honest, sometimes they just deliver the cacao to a black box where it's fermented and shipped. They don't, how do you say, involvement stops there. Right. So even though they would like to ferment, they don't know how to, because those buying the cacao don't want them to know. So this is so, right? With cacao it's also the same. Some farmers don't get the feedback because they don't try the end product. It's so far away and so splitted that they, even if they want it, they don't know if this or that is improving the quality or not. Right? It's a very, and then add to that the genetic diversity, the whatever. So it's a very complicated business, right?
Have the farmers that you work with, the co-ops that you work with, have they tried some of the chocolate that makers have made using that cacao?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what was the feedback? Did they like it? Not like it? What did they think?
No, of course they like it. I mean, they're always. But this is always the case. Well,
because it's very different, maybe, than the chocolate they're used to. That's why I'm wondering. Did they think it was better, worse than the chocolate they're used to?
No, it's better. But this cake started something very interesting. Some of them have asked for grinders and roasters, like into our equipment, and both co-ops now make chocolate, but like modern one. Which, on the one hand, it's interesting because they have started selling it locally, and on the other hand, it makes our life easier. Why? Because they get direct feedback. They don't need to wait for the chocolate maker to send a bar or whatever, or to say, look, this batch was terrible.
Okay. So the co-ops that you were talking about, they actually make the finished product there, and they...
Slowly. They started like last year, but I've seen such price popping up. Of course, the chocolate equipment has, it's more available than ever before. It's cheaper also. So it was a matter of time that such small kitchen equipment would reach the origin, which can be interesting. But again, in Mexico, cacao is not just a cash crop. There is also a tradition that to build on top, right? To build upon. In Africa, I guess that people don't care about cacao. It's not part of the food culture, so there's no emotional attachment to it.
Right.
And you will see it while we were filming for the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund. Many people express their emotional attachment to the farm. It's like it's a sin to give up, even though they don't make any money. They cannot just cut down the trees that were passed down generation to generation, right? And they don't want to touch the genetics because it's something emotional. It's not. They don't even make money, right? So that's also something that, and such people are also more prone to start making chocolate.
Right. Sounds like, that was one of my questions too, is how tied how are Mexicans to cacao, which, isn't obvious. A lot of people would assume a lot of Mexicans are tied to culture of cacao and chocolate. But is there a difference? Do you know whether you're in Mexico City or in Chiapas or somewhere else?
Yeah.
Is there a different attachment? In the city, is it more candy bars, or do they still part of this culture of cacao and chocolate too?
Yeah. No, it's just in the growing regions. You leave the growing regions, and in Mexico City, nobody could care less about chocolate. They don't care. They don't know. That's why B2B projects struggle in Mexico.
Yeah,
because nobody cares,
right? Like you mentioned, the culture is there in their areas where they grow it. They can't cut down the trees because of that attachment. That's amazing. But then you go to the city, with lots of people from all over the world and different mindset, and it's just another product on the shelf, right?
Right. So in Oaxaca also, but this is more due to recipes. So, but the thing is that most of the tradition has already been lost. You have countless of traditional drinks made with cacao and with other ingredients, right? But let's say, for example, in Oaxaca, we were in Teotitlán del Valle, and they made for us chocolate atole. Chocolate atole contains over 20 ingredients: roasted corn, roasted wheat, roasted cinnamon, pataste, cacao, sugar. I mean, it was, I can't even remember how many ingredients I saw there, right? It's very time consuming, right? So, and only a handful of women are still doing that.
Wow.
But you have, again, something to build upon. So such premium projects like very fancy high-end restaurants are trying to revive that.
When you say the farmers in this, and I imagine them older in my mind. What are the ages of these people who are getting involved, who are excited about this? Are they generally older, or are there a lot of young people excited about it? Oh, okay.
The rare cases of younger farmers, and by young I mean 45 to 55, are the ones that are, that are caring about making things different. But I've seen younger generations very excited about chocolate. But I'm sure this is not an exception, that I mean, maybe for them farming is boring, but if they see that they can make chocolate, which is more exciting, then maybe they do care about farming.
Right.
So I've seen that too. Food culture in Mexico, contrary to popular belief, is terrible. I mean, Mexico is the second fattest country in the world after the US. Why? Because people eat rubbish. Sugary drinks, Coca-Cola all the way in Chiapas.
Yeah. A lot of that industrialized junk food really made its way into countries like that as well, right? We think of, we go to Mexico, as a Canadian, they go to Mexico, they have the best tacos and the best this. But the locals and whatnot, they eat a lot of junk food, a lot of chips and this and that. It's become part of the culture, like America too.
But even tacos is junk food mostly. I mean, in most cases, I mean, I don't want to talk down. I mean, Mexican food is very diverse, but even Mexicans are ruining Mexican food. Mexican food is not just about tacos, right? So you are losing traditional food too because people demand junk, right? So it's like you are losing. I mean, you have a huge food diversity, but you just stick to the soul food, right? To the greasy tacos.
But that's happening. I mean, that's happening in many countries, many countries, which is unfortunate. Really incredible recipes and more better ways of preparing food are becoming lost with my generation and younger. You go on Instagram and everything is just condiments and sauces and cheese, and it's not real authentic food. So it's definitely a problem everywhere.
It's a shared battle everywhere. But as an example, Chiapas is a very indigenous state, right? It's the region in the world with the highest per capita consumption of Coca-Cola. 2 liters per day per person.
Oh, wow.
You see indigenous children with bottles of Coca-Cola bigger than themselves. Right? So you have a health crisis, you have a food crisis, nobody cooks, everybody's being lost, everything is being lost. You end up losing the quality of the ingredients behind. You lose the chiles, you lose the corn. I mean, as an example, I'm not criticizing. I mean, I'm not just saying that.
No, it's true. Even like in Canada too. Like I'm Italian, my family's Italian. We grew up in the Toronto area, which has a lot of Italians and bakeries and this, but even that is affected. Like if you're someone who's really into food, you go to this Italian bakery, you go to that Italian, and you're like, they're using bad ingredients. They're eating a lot of, the younger generations start to get more lazy. We're not going to cook a meal. We're going to go out to eat. And the quality is not as good. So it's the same thing is happening everywhere. It's not like you're talking bad about Mexican food or culture or anything like that. It's just, you're telling what's happening. It's unfortunate. Yeah.
For example, Alisa is a member of the Headroom Cacao Preservation. She was a filmmaker while we were traveling all over southern Mexico. She's Italian-American, and she's living in Italy. And she said, bread in Italy is terrible. I mean, the pasta that they use, the coffee is terrible. Why? Because you get stuck in tradition and you lose what made that good, right? It's the same in Mexico. In Mexico, everybody eats tortillas every day. Hey, corn is native to Mexico. The genetic, like kilometer or mile zero of corn is in Mexico, where teosinte mutated into what we know understand as corn. And the tortillas that people eat are terrible. You have over 60 heirloom varieties. Nobody cares. So you have many battles.
I think that's a big issue, is ingredients, right? That's what the bean to bar movement is about too. It's ingredients,
Right.
The ingredients. That's what we have to preserve.
Right. So, and there are many battles in Mexico and all over the place, but I'm focusing on cacao. Right.
Of course.
So, because it's native, it has a long history in Mexico, and most locals don't care. But those that care need to work together.
So now that you have this cacao fruit pulp that you're making as well, do locals, are they eating that as well, incorporating it, or is that more for export?
No, well, we are just starting with the pulp. I mean, it takes a lot of capital, a lot of investment. So also all the projects around the world that work with pulp are in Ecuador. Why? Because in Ecuador you have an endless supply of CCN51, which has one virtue. I mean, if you run into pulp anywhere else in the world, most probably it's CCN51. Why? Because although the cacao apparently tastes terrible, it can get more commodity than that. It has one virtue. The pulp yield is huge. So the pods are pulp bombs. So you can make the most of that. So that's why some brands that focus on that, they focus on, no, we are upcycling the fruit, Yeah, but at the same time, you are just raising the rainforest, to the ground, because CCN51 it depletes the soil. It doesn't need any shade. So my idea is, in order to improve farm gate prices too, is to buy the whole fruit from the farmers also, because most of them are elderly. And the problem of not finding enough young people to farm is not something that we will eventually run into. It's now happening. Now, this year, you don't find people to harvest cacao in Tabasco. You don't find them, or in Chiapas. They don't care. It's they go to the cities, they go to the US, but in many other fruits, the problem with cacao is that, unlike other fruits, when you harvest it, you are not over, you are not done. You have a papaya, you have a coconut, whatever, and you harvest it, and that's it, not with cacao. You harvest it, which is as time consuming as all other fruits, but then you need to go crack the pods, you need to ferment them, you need to dry them. It's a mess.
Yeah.
So my idea was to just harvest the pods and buy them the fruit, pay them more as if they would do all the process, But it's difficult. It's difficult. I mean, we have a plant in Tabasco. We are about to kickstart like large scale production, but it's hard. It's hard because let's be honest. Some farmers, they just want to cheat you. They just want easy money, and you close a deal with them. You go back to buy the pots, and it's double. So also, there are many. You have big multinationals buying already, so they don't want you to interfere. So it's a very complex topic that we can talk about later. But again, it's not a project along the line that we already discussed, trying to add value where the cacao is being grown.
Okay.
Making chocolate, making pulp. Yes, sir.
So for people who want to look into your business, other than the cacao, what other products are you selling right now?
Yeah, I sell the fine cacao for bean to bar. I team up, Mexico's, I would say, among the most international bean to bar brands, Cuna de Piedra. Is Cuna de Piedra. We work hand in hand from the very beginning. They source all cacao from me. And we have been working for years. So we team up to offer also nibs and like baking chocolate. It's not that I'm doing it. We work hand in hand with that. And once we launch like seriously the pulp project, I mean, with pulp and husk, you can do a lot of different things. You can sell the frozen pulp. You can freeze dry the pulp and make wafers that you can coat with chocolate. You can make fruit leather or fruit snacks with the pulp. You can make flour with the husk. You can make also compost or nutrient-dense fertilizer. You can make like a sort of cider with the pulp, which is going back to its roots. Right. Because I get the point that 5,000 years ago they were fermenting the pulp. You know, you can make a brew very easily, right? We even try to make a sort of mezcal, like a spirit with the pulp. So there are a lot of different ways to make the most of the husk and the pulp. I wouldn't focus on juices because I don't see. I mean, you can make a juice out of any other.
It's a fruit, right? So whatever you can use other fruits, you can do probably with that.
Yeah, but the thing is that I mean the pulp content of cacao is not that high. So just using pulp for juices only with CCN51 makes sense because you have an endless supply of CCN51, right? But the only other project that, well, they are far ahead of us is KOA in Europe. They are building a plant, cacao pulp processing plant in Ghana. You know, in Ghana, as far as I know, they don't grow CCN51, but they try to do it, right? So it's another interesting project.
Yeah, I think I heard of that one.
Because I mean, you can also make concentrated juice syrup, you know, to sweeten chocolate drinks or whatever. I mean, or you can make candies.
Yeah, I think Valrhona has that already. Some sort of cacao fruit syrup.
Yeah, Valrhona has it already, and I suspect they source it from Ecuador. Probably. In Ecuador, there are just 2-3 companies that do that, and Valrhona is not very transparent about what they do. Right? So that's why they are obsessed with highlighting. No, we are upcycling. Yeah, we are upcycling, but at the expense of what? Right.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's another example of trying to do something with improving the life of farmers and creating value.
Yeah.
You know, it might fail, it might be successful. I don't know.
Huh? You're doing a lot. There's a lot of facets that you're trying to achieve. So
yeah,
hopefully you have some good people there in Mexico you can rely on because you can't do that by yourself.
Well, I hope to. I'm not so sure sometimes, but it's hard. I mean, if you have to fail now, right?
Right.
So but I mean, building. I mean, you don't have a blueprint of a cacao pulp processing plant, right? I team up with a lady that tried to do it for many years, that made a lot of investment, but in my eyes, like very misdirected. So investing in things that were not urgent. So that's why we team up, and I invested also to make everything ready. But again, you think that you will need so much money, and at the end of the day, you need more than you expected.
Always,
because, and in countries such as Mexico, this is almost a death sentence because there is no way to get any financing, any capital from banks or from whatever, just from people that already have money.
Yeah.
So and of course, you're not going to let someone in and take half of the company when they have no idea about the business and they just have the money. Right. So that's why everything went slower than I expected, but apparently we are almost there.
The other Theobroma, bicolor, that you sell that.
Yes.
Why do you sell that? What do people use it for? What can you tell about people who never had that before?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Why? Because I would say that after cacao is 99.99999% of the Theobroma family market. The distant second is bicolor, Theobroma bicolor, right? That it's basically it's not very popular, and I get that.
It doesn't have the same. The cocoa butter is different than the fat in the bicolor. It doesn't have that same wonderful texture.
Exactly. I mean, among many other things. The main point with bicolor, it was very valued by Mayas and Aztecs. I mean, they use it, but it was not very popular for Europeans, so it was totally neglected until today, which is still neglected.
So what place does it have then in chocolate?
Yeah. Well, first I sourced it from Oaxaca. Why? Because in Oaxaca it grows wild. High in the mountains of the Sierra Norte of Oaxaca, you have Theobroma trees. Nobody knows. I've run into like 6 different varietals. They don't have any name. They don't bear any name. Nobody cares. No, zero research, right? The different flavors. Nobody knows anything. So it's also the problem with bicolor is that it's first extremely labor intensive. You cannot even harvest the pod. You need to wait until it falls down from the tree, because if you harvest it and it's not ripe, you are done. So the farmers in northern Oaxaca collect the pods that fall down from the tree. Then you crack them. The husk is very hard. Then you extract the pulp, which is very fibrous, very sticky. They sort of semi-ferment it just to loosen the pulp. Then you need to wash it, which is again very labor intensive because the pulp is very sticky. I mean, nobody, as far as I know, nobody has tried to ferment it. So you wash it, then you dry it, and then the problem is that you need to roast it, and then winnowing it is very difficult because cacao equipment is not suited for working with bicolor. So
does the husk get stuck more easily? It doesn't come off as easily, or what?
Right. And it's also heavier. So I have seen that the end flavor is affected by what the farmer does. Sometimes they don't remove all the pulp, so the flavor is better, but also harder to winnow. And there's so little research that we don't know much.
Okay.
Why can you use it? How can you use it? Well, first, I would say that it's the real white chocolate. I would say, because you are using a Theobroma, right. But mainly it's about mixing it with other things, cereal bars or drinks. Atoles. There is one restaurant in Oaxaca that we interview the owner, and she focuses on bicolor.
Okay.
She makes bicolor drinks. She makes bicolor moles.
Wow.
It's super interesting. I mean, we don't know much. We don't know really how to process it.
I could see that in a mole, like in a food, I can see using that. Because the flavor I don't really like the texture. If you make it like a chocolate bar, I don't really like that.
Yeah.
But the flavor is interesting, so I can see that in food.
Okay. Yeah, but again, we have never fermented bicolor. We don't know how we will taste it. It's washed. It's like washed cacao, but bicolor.
Right.
And there are many varieties, but there are, for example, some varieties that are rounder, smaller, and the tree yields 2 harvests. Then some are bigger, but just 1 harvest a year. It has, I mean, against all odds, people still grow it. But it's making cereal bars, such as the one that Siren does, right. It's interesting, you know? There are other projects that do use the nips. It's like a free nut.
That's free nut. Yeah. I could see that.
So it tastes like a nut. It's not a nut. So, I mean, I get it's difficult, but that's why I also offer it peeled by the Chinantec farmers. They are indigenous farmers, mostly female women.
That's good as well. So it gives them a bit more work, and the consumer doesn't have to peel them or anything like that as well.
Right. So it's ready to use.
Yeah.
So I mean, we don't know. I mean, it's just a niche product.
Okay.
But nobody uses it. So
do you know if have you ever come across information where there's been hybrids of cacao cacao and bicolor?
No. Never. Actually, again, you don't even have. Nobody has really researched with how many varieties you have. And like cacao, nobody cares about bicolor, so everything is spontaneous, right? Most varieties are growing wild, right?
I asked you this a little bit at the beginning. What are your goals for your company? Just to clearly put it out there to people who are watching. What is it that you're trying to achieve right now with what you're doing?
Yeah, right now, well, it's a matter, I would say, as many other businesses, of survival. I mean, the pandemic was an absolute disaster. Also, the logistic meltdown was terrible. I get it. If you're a big wholesaler that imports whole containers, if ocean freight goes through the roof, you don't care. But I couldn't export by sea to Europe or Australia or New Zealand. It was impossible. For over a year, I couldn't. So it was a huge challenge. Then the pandemic, everything closing down, also affected sales. So after all this, I mean, we didn't exit this turmoil and scatter. So I would say first survival, also because farmers are having a hard time too, right? But now that everything, we managed to survive everything, now we have other challenges, right? A harvest disaster in Tabasco. The Mexican peso is the most overvalued currency in the world right now. I mean, nobody understands why. It gained a lot of momentum. Many speculators started investing in the Mexican peso. So we are expensive. We are expensive by default, but now we are more expensive. So it's even more difficult. Right. So again, after all this turmoil, we're still in another turmoil. So I would say survival also for the farmers, to sell as much as possible. If you make less selling, then you have to sell twice, right? So being a small exporter is tricky because shipping costs are higher.
And where do you currently ship to? Who can you ship to your product?
Yeah, I ship mostly the US for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. We are slowly expanding to Europe, but this was canceled for a year and a half. We also export to New Zealand. Interestingly enough, we ship every year. It's the unlikeliest place where you would find Mexican cacao, but you can find them. Well, it's mostly the US. We have a big customer in Spain, for example. We have just shipped to the UK, to New Zealand. We hope to be able to export to Australia soon. Okay. We have been working for 3 years to export, but the pandemic, then a currency exchange crisis, then ocean freight, then ports closing down, so we couldn't. So we hope to be able to export. Okay. We have some customers in Mexico too, which is so the two origins. Coming back to the origins and things like that, to put it into perspective, Tabasco is unlike Chiapas. So in Tabasco, cacao has always been important, both for economic and political reasons. So in the 20th century, it was one of the biggest and most important growing regions in Latin America. People maybe don't realize it anymore, but 50, 60 years ago, Tabasco was full of cacao. So when you have a cash crop that is important, then politics and policies start playing a role. So in Tabasco, you did see a replacement of the old heirloom varieties. So cacao from Ecuador or from other countries was imported 50, 60 years ago that blended into what you already had. But for that reason, genetics there are less interesting than in Soconusco. So, but still there, and there you have big multinationals such as Nestle buying a lot of the harvest. People do ferment, but it's terrible. So in that case, I work hand in hand with farmers, but I ferment directly because there are no co-ops. You have big buyers, you have coyotes all over the place. So there are no co-ops there, just big facilities processing cacao for Nestle. Right. In that case, I do ferment directly. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Okay. Although I team up with farmers, I rent from a farmer. So, but it's another logic than in Soconusco, right? So that's my second origin. But harvests are lately they're very unreliable. You have floods, you have too much heat, too much rain, whatever. So I also have a line of lavado cacao, premium lavado cacao. So lavado doesn't necessarily have to be bad. Right. I source cacao also from Oaxaca, from these Chinantec indigenous farmers that grow bicolor and grow cacao, but it's so small that it doesn't pay off to ferment it. It's so little the amount, and
Mm.
also something is so cold that you can't even ferment it either.
Mm.
But this, coming back to what we were discussing at the beginning, drinking chocolate is a very neglected product. You know,
I
so
prefer, obviously I'm not drinking Mexican chocolate, but even a lot of the chocolate bars and chocolates that I have, I love making it into a drink, getting a nice foam with that going. It's beautiful. So I would agree. And the thing is too, a lot of countries like Mexico, origin countries, are starting to make chocolate, but an issue is the temperature. It's very hot there because obviously chocolate originally was a drink. The temperature didn't matter so much. But if people can move towards the drinking chocolate, the drinking culture, and like you said, all the recipes that Mexicans still have in the South there, that would be something amazing to revive,
But origin countries are copying, are mimicking what developed countries do. And everybody is trying to make a bean to bar brand in Colombia, in Ecuador. I mean, but the tradition is to drink, but they are drinking terrible chocolate. Give them something good, but it's not that obvious. And also in the US or Canada, sometimes drinking chocolate is like something of that plays a lesser role, right? You use the scraps or whatever.
Yeah.
So
that's the problem. We need to change the mentality, especially in North America, where drinking chocolate is for kids or just whatever. No, it's just as the same caliber as wine and fine coffee and things like that. We need to educate that.
Yeah, but also you need to keep in mind that eating chocolate and drinking chocolate are different things. Yeah. What you value, I mean, the virtues you look in a bean, a cacao bean, in order to make eating chocolate. I mean, the subtleness, the complex, subtle flavors. When you turn them into a drink, everything is watered down.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but everything, fermentation, everything is like devoted to making good fine cacao for eating chocolate.
Right.
So I have tasted the best bars ever that were the blandest drinking chocolate at the same time. So the virtue of lavado is that, I mean, it's not suitable for eating chocolate because you might find it too bitter or too astringent or too whatever. But when everything gets watered down in a drink,
that's a bit like coffee, right? Coffee, you're not eating the coffee beans, you water it down with the water, and that allows for the flavors to come out. So if the cocoa bean, the lavado cocoa bean is too intense, that's okay, because you're going to dilute it with the water.
Exactly. And but I mean, not all lavados are good. I mean, there is a lot of commodity lavado that's terrible, but it's also healthier because the polyphenol content is like 3-4 times, it's much higher than because fermenting is basically cooking. You are cooking. I mean, always a food will always, agricultural product will always be healthier if you eat it raw. Cooking breaks down nutrients.
Right. Usually, there's some research that suggests that the fermenting or the roasting makes some of the polyphenols larger, so they stay in the blood more, they stay in longer. But it's true that the total polyphenol content does diminish as well. So I think there's good in that as well, definitely.
Yeah. So something that I'm promoting slowly but steadily is like a range of niche high quality lavados. That again, in a drink you cannot melt 80 grams. I mean, it's also about cost. So the stronger the flavor, you can eat a bar and it can last for a week, but you can drink a bar and you don't even notice. Yeah. Right?
No, that's true, because first of all, like you said, if it's a beautiful flavor bar, when you dilute it with milk or water, whatever, the flavor is gone. But then also, you got to add quite a bit of that bean to bar chocolate to make a tasty drink. Otherwise, it's too dull, right? So you're thinking of lavado almost like a coffee bean now, right? It's got this intense flavor on its own. You can't eat it, but you turn it into a drink and it's perfect, right? And that's a good thing to think about. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, you need to fine tune also the recipe, but it's also cheaper. It's also easier, and especially, and that's something that I'm stressing a lot or highlighting. I mean, you can't have really a single farmer cacao, because in order to ferment, you need to group a minimum amount of farmers to reach a minimum amount of wet beans, to ferment. Whereas traditionally in Mexico, farmers were harvesting 1 kilo, 2 kilos of wet beans, whatever, and they were washing them 1 kilo at a time, and then you have the cacao. So I can tell you, this cacao comes from this person. Why? Because you didn't need to reach a heap of 400 kilos of wet beans to ferment one box.
Wow, that's a good
point.
So
you can make it like more, you can fine tune everything. So
yeah, and some people will disagree with you. They'll say, you have to ferment cacao. There's no way about it. But that's not true. There are varietals, there are genetic little bubbles here and there where the cacao doesn't really need to be fermented. I've tasted it too, so that's a good point. That's definitely a new area that people can start to discover.
Doesn't need to be fermented or can't be fermented because again, either the temperatures or the harvest, some trees just the yield takes place or the harvest takes place in 1 month, or it keeps on bearing fruit for months. So you get small amounts at a given time. And lavado, you can wash 100 grams, right?
But like you said, there's good lavado and there's bad lavado. So it has to be from a good genetic spectrum, right?
Indeed, and that's what we are working.
Yeah.
And first, you can tell a more thorough, you can focus the product on a specific farmer.
Right.
And you can work with genetics, with cacaos that you would have to mix with other cacaos necessarily if you would like to ferment it, because there's no other way. It's too little. So, we're exploring it, but it's unknown territory. Yeah. Drinking chocolate in general is unknown territory. People drink cocoa or whatever syrup they throw at them,
exactly.
Right?
Like why use cocoa powder, go through all that process and have a product that's just okay, when like coffee, you can use the whole bean, grind up the bean and make the drink, right? That's a really good point.
And the problem with lavado that people tend to neglect is that they say, no, it's terrible. You need to put a lot of sugar. Yes, why? Because you take lavado and you process it the traditional way in Mexico. You over roast it, you don't conch it, you just use a grinder and, like a corn mill. Yeah. And there's zero grinding or conching. So don't blame the bean, blame the process.
Yeah.
And
process
that's why
is a big part of it. Yeah.
Right. And that's why, as I've said, tradition, you need to adapt tradition to modern times. Otherwise, you get stuck. You do you think you do that you are keeping a tradition that it's very old, and you don't notice that slowly, things change, and everything the agriculture, unlike what your grandmother was cooking.
That's the thing, right? Like tradition is good. A lot of people want to get rid of all tradition, which is not good. Tradition is why a lot of those farmers have preserved those cacao trees, right? Like why they don't want to cut it down. It's part of tradition. It's part of their culture. So tradition is good, but tradition stays the same while the world keeps moving, and it has to come together at some point where you don't lose the tradition, but you have to adapt it in a way where it's still quality tradition, right? It's still quality food, quality chocolate. Yeah.
Exactly. And if you don't do it, everything starts eroding.
And then you might lose it altogether.
Again, you have a time machine and you go to Mexico 100 years ago, they were not drinking this chocolate, they were not eating these tortillas, right? Because tradition starts eroding. And there's an interesting thing. When we were interviewing some of the people in Oaxaca, they said everything started changing in Mexico when TVs started to be common in households. You had TVs and people stopped doing the atoles at home. People stopped milling the corn to make the tortillas. People stopped whatever, you go on, and then nobody does anything. Nobody cooks anymore, right? So how can you preserve tradition if you don't cook anymore? It will be in the hands of a couple of high-end restaurants,
Yeah, that's a good point. Today we have TVs right here,
right,
which is not good too. Even kids just all day, boom, 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 boom. So no, that's a really good point as well.
So then
ingredients, right? Ingredients that's a big point of tradition and food is quality ingredients. That's what has been lost over time, is people don't notice. I grew up on grocery store food in Canada. It's not the same. You know, when my family here in Canada makes tomato sauce, they add a bit of basil, they add this, they add that, make it taste good, even if they're growing their own tomatoes. When I went to Italy and Sicily, my family picked the tomatoes off in the garden that day. They didn't put anything in the sauce, maybe a little bit of salt. And it was incredible. The flavor was so good because ingredients matter. Ingredients matter. And that's what people forget these days.
Yeah,
you know?
Ingredients matter, indeed. And well, that's why just think of farmers or people in the Middle Ages. Over 50% of the caloric intake was bread. But what bread? You know? Sourdough bread, bread that nourished them. Imagine the bread that we have now.
Yeah.
So in Mexico, everybody, again, with the tortillas are terrible.
It's not the same.
Because it's corn flour, you know, that it's very terrible, but people still consume them as if they would nourish them, and they don't.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So when you talk about cacao, there are so many battles. It's a broader topic. About farming, ingredients, culture. You cannot just focus on
no. And I see that you like to talk about everything. So which is good. But I think we have to start winding down now.
Sure.
But so we talked about, and what is the best way for people to contact you if they want to get in touch with you for wholesaling, whatever? What's the best way?
Well, my Instagram or my webpage where I have it's Revival Cacao in Instagram, and my webpage is also revivalcacao.com. And as I said, I don't work with distributors. Everything is direct trade or else. I arrange everything door to door. So it's not that, it doesn't necessarily be, especially in Canada or the US, the cacao is not more expensive. You know, I just use as a reference the prices that other wholesalers are selling. So I'm not more expensive. I keep everything as direct trade and like as the value chain is as short as possible, so you get higher market prices, and at the same time, chocolate makers end up paying more or less the same. So so
wonderful.
So I'm focused again on fermented cacao and lavado. Hopefully, in a couple of months, I will start launching the pulp products. Which has taken a lot of time, but again, I tried freeze-dried pulp wafer coated with chocolate. It's like a Kit Kat, like a Kit Kat, but with making the most of the whole food.
No, that's amazing.
It blew my mind. It can be a huge hit, but going there, it's difficult. All the machinery, we have a automated pulping machine, it took forever to get ready. It took more, then you need, the good thing about Mexico, about Tabasco, is that everything is nearby. I don't need to go high in the mountains to get the cacao. Everything is, we are located like within 100 kilometers of 65% of Mexican cacao production.
Right. Thank you very much. I had a lot of fun talking to you. I hope to talk to you again. And I really wish you well with what you're doing. I really hope it starts to grow and more people hear about it. So thank you, Alejandro. Very nice.
Thank you. Let's stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Talk to you again. Take care. Bye. Download the free Bean to Bar app to connect with incredible chocolate makers from around the world. Also be sure to visit beantobarworld.com, your portal for all things fine chocolate, virtual tastings, free learning resources, research, and much more. Subscribe to the newsletter to stay in touch, and donate to the free app and free resources here. Contact me for any chocolate-related questions you may have.